Hello, everyone. My name is Grace Keenan. I graduated New College in 2024 with a classics degree and served as student body president and member of the Board of Trustees for 2 years. I've stayed local in Sarasota this past year, and I'm starting my master's in education policy at Harvard this fall. Welcome to the fifth and final episode in the series, 5 Disruptive Principles in the Liberal Arts. This episode, we will focus on assessment for excellence. The series is produced by Alt Liberal Arts, and these programs would not be possible without the support from the Open Society Foundation. Alt Liberal Arts is a global education initiative concerned with academic freedom and civic engagement in the liberal arts. In collaboration with Bard College and the Open Society University Network, Alt Liberal Arts offered free global online lectures and courses from which you can register at altliberalarts.org. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can enter your questions or comments throughout this online seminar. We look forward to discussing as many of your questions as time will allow. During this challenging time in higher education, the 5 disruptive principles in the liberal arts featured in these series are now more important than ever because they are disruptive to authoritarian ways of thinking and protective against falsehoods and propaganda. They embody the true meaning of academic freedom. We have looked at principles of student agency, faculty and student engagement, mastery, and depth and breadth. Today's online seminar, we ask the question, do grades empower students and faculty to pursue excellence? And to spoil it, we argue that grades are harder to defend because in a traditional grading system, the goal is not learning, the goal is getting the right grade. New College of Florida never adopted grades and instead used the system of narrative evaluations. While you don't often see this in academia, you see it a lot more in the workforce with employers preferring evaluations. Founded in 1960, New College of Florida in Sarasota, Florida, was a bold innovator in the liberal arts, which by 2020 resulted in its ranking as one of the top 5 liberal arts colleges in the United States. And in 2023, New College became global news when a majority of trustees were replaced in an effort to enact a new mission, to define the college in ways that conform to the demands of a less tolerant and more closed society. This educational project began with the commission of a series of essays from 5 scholars, Dr. Robert Benedetti, Dan Chambliss, Stephen Miles, Julianne Pereira-Bulgave, and Eric Shinkler, each highlighting disruptive principles as they were practiced at the historic New College of Florida from the years 1970 to 2020. Alt Liberal Arts is an independent educational organization and is not affiliated with New College, and the views represented tonight do not represent authorities at the official New College of Florida. Now I welcome you to a special experience practice at the historic New College. Each semester or term, when it came time for students to choose their classes, professors would present 15-minute mini classes in the hopes of engaging students to explore their subjects. Up next, you will experience a mini class presented by Stephen Miles on the principles of assessment for excellence, taped before a live audience at the Manatee Performing Arts Center. This mini class is based upon the essay with contributors James Feeney, Mary Ruiz, Miriam Wallace, and Kimbo York, with videographer by Daniel Podhast. Afterwards, we will engage our panel in a dialogue and entertain your questions, which you can enter in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now, Alt Liberal Arts presents Assessment for Excellence with Dr. Stephen Miles.
When it comes to higher education, we rarely stop to ask, are grades actually a useful measure of academic success? Grades are one of the most deeply ingrained traditions in higher education. They shape admissions, scholarships, job applications, and institutional rankings. We use them as a shorthand for achievement, as a way of sorting students, and as a tool for motivation. Grades determine who excels, who struggles, who gains access to elite universities and internships, and who is left behind. They dictate scholarships, employment opportunities, and entire academic careers. But ask college students how they approach their education in a traditionally graded environment, and you'll start to notice a pattern. They choose easy A courses. They skim readings to focus only on what will be on the test. They search course reviews to figure out which professors give the highest grades with the least effort. They share files of previous exams, swap notes on which assignments can be skipped with minimal penalty, and in some cases use AI-generated responses to produce work that meets grading rubrics without true engagement. Why? Because in a traditional grading system, the goal isn't learning. The goal is getting the right grade. Unfortunately, this grade-centric behavior starts long before students arrive at college. Even in high school, students meticulously calculate the exact scores needed to maintain their grade point average, or GPA, because a single bad grade can derail scholarship opportunities and limit access to elite institutions, making students more likely to choose courses based on GPA protection rather than intellectual growth. Once in college, many continue this strategic disengagement. Some avoid electives that could broaden their skills simply because they fear a challenging professor's grading policies might hurt their overall standing. Others sidestep independent research projects, tutorials, or interdisciplinary seminars, choosing pre-structured courses where grading is predictable and straightforward. Faculty see this phenomenon firsthand. When presented with a truly open-ended and demanding assignment, students often ask, "What do I need to do to get an A?" It is a question that reveals just how deeply grading has shaped their mindset. Meanwhile, faculty face their own struggles with traditional grading, which limits the meaningful assessment of a student's pursuit of excellence. In-depth mastery of a subject is hard, and striving for excellence depends on assessing a student's competency, not just their performance. Where is the space for reflecting on how a student has progressed? Grades might determine who passes the course, but leave no room for a student's trial and error as they grapple with the subject. What about the learning that occurs outside the classroom and talents not captured in grading? The co-curricular experiences that are such an important part of social learning and self-knowledge remain ungraded, which sends the message that these activities are not part of a well-rounded liberal arts education. Plagiarism is harder than ever to detect, especially with AI-generated content complicating authorship. How does an institution put a check on grade inflation, which is known to be rampant and diminishes the very meaning of grades? Professors known as tough graders often hear complaints, prompting grade appeals that sometimes escalate to deans and other administrators. For untenured faculty in particular, evaluations by their students, collected at the end of courses and often used in career advancement decisions, create pressure to award higher grades rather than challenging students. And then there's the psychological toll. Grades don't just measure effort, they shape identity. A student who consistently earns top marks might begin to associate their sense of self-worth with academic performance, feeling pressure to sustain those grades or risk failure. Meanwhile, a student struggling in a single course may internalize that struggle as an indication that they are simply not intelligent enough, when in reality, they may just need a different learning approach. Grades also favor the lucky ones. Students whose parents have college degrees or live in communities offering good schools, or whose family budget supports tutors, receive outside benefits in a system geared to teach them how to get good grades. Grading punishes the unlucky or those who are late developers. Grades cannot measure how far we have come or where we are going. The pressure to perform in this system turns education into a competition rather than an exploration. Instead of fostering intellectual curiosity, grades create a high-stakes environment where the fear of failure overshadows the desire to learn. The result? Students focus less on mastering the subject and more on mastering the system. This isn't learning, it's performance under pressure. Academic grading is simply difficult to defend on its own merits. So then, the question we need to ask is, if grades don't actually help students learn, why do we rely on them so heavily? For more than 50 years, historic New College challenged the fundamental assumption that grades are the best way to assess knowledge and mastery. Instead of grades, the college pioneered an approach that eliminated traditional grading metrics entirely. It was a bold experiment, and it wasn't an arbitrary decision. When New College decided to take this radically different approach, the institution rejected letter grades and replaced them with academic contracts, narrative evaluations, and direct faculty-student collaboration. New College faculty assessed how students solved problems, how they constructed an argument, discerned meaning, persuaded a listener of the plausibility of their view, wrote for clarity and precision, and contributed to a group's success. Instead of receiving an A, a B, or a C, students worked with faculty members each semester to define their academic goals, coursework, and areas for growth. At the end of the term, rather than simply assigning a letter grade, faculty provided detailed evaluations of performance, pinpointing strengths along the way with areas needing further improvement. A failed course never appeared on the student's transcript, but the lessons remained in the narrative evaluation. This approach reshaped the way students engaged with their education. Risk-taking was encouraged. Without the fear of a low grade dragging down a GPA, students felt free to take challenging courses or explore new fields without hesitation. Learning became a conversation. Faculty were no longer just judges assigning scores. They were mentors engaged in ongoing dialogue. Self-direction was essential. Students took responsibility for their education because they were expected to articulate and shape their own goals. With this model, education was no longer about jumping through hoops for an arbitrary letter. It was all about intellectual mastery. Mastery at New College wasn't just about completing coursework. It was about demonstrating true competency through engagement, critical thought, and original contributions to a field of study. Nowhere was this more evident than in the classroom discussions and the senior thesis defense, known as the baccalaureate examination. While lectures and readings were part of the curriculum, the success of a class depended upon how well students could engage in dialogue, challenge ideas, and push discussions forward. This placed an emphasis not just on individual comprehension, but on the collective process of learning, a recognition that understanding deepens when knowledge is tested through discussion, shaped by multiple perspectives and refined through debate. Faculty weren't simply grading responses. They were gauging depth of thought, intellectual flexibility, and the ability to articulate and defend a position. And then came the final academic milestone, the oral defense of the senior thesis. This wasn't just another requirement to check off the list. It was a public event where students presented their original research or creative projects before a faculty panel of 3 or more professors whom they themselves recruited. This presentation wasn't just an endpoint. It was often a launching pad for future work. Some students expanded their theses into graduate research, professional careers, or even publications before they had officially graduated. But what made this model so powerful wasn't just the final demonstration of mastery. It was the culture of academic agency and self-direction that supported it from the start. If a subject wasn't offered in the course catalog, but aligned with their intellectual pursuits, students had the freedom to propose a tutorial or independent study with faculty sponsorship. This meant that learning wasn't confined to pre-existing structures. Rather, it grew dynamically, adapting to the curiosity of each student. When it came time for the senior thesis, students were expected to propose and refine their own topics, conduct meaningful research, and secure faculty sponsorship. A physics major designed a jungle gym for adults to explore biomechanics and movement. Another traveled to Poland and produced a thesis on interwar Polish shtetl communities. An urban study student investigated the logistical and psychological factors influencing hurricane evacuations from coastal barrier islands. If one faculty member declined to sponsor a project, students explored other options, refining their proposals and learning along the way how to advocate for their ideas. This was more than an academic exercise. It was a process that required students to develop confidence in their intellectual voice, prepare thoughtful arguments, and persuade experts of the value of their work. Through this system, New College didn't just cultivate knowledge. It cultivated scholars, critical thinkers, and innovators, students who didn't just learn from books, but from the very process of shaping their own education. One of the major criticisms of narrative evaluations is that students need grades to graduate for graduate school admissions or job applications. But here's the reality. Many graduate programs prioritize qualitative evaluations and in-depth faculty recommendations over GPA alone. Most employers don't ask for a GPA because they care more about experience, skills, and critical thinking ability. Think about how professional development works beyond college. Employees aren't given letter grades. They receive detailed performance reviews. They receive goal-oriented feedback from mentors and supervisors. Whole industries, from medicine to law and to engineering, rely not on GPA, but on demonstrated expertise and mentorship-based evaluations. If grades aren't necessary to evaluate professionals, why do we insist they're necessary for students? Of course, grades aren't going to disappear from higher education overnight. But the rigid one-size-fits-all model of letter grading is increasingly being challenged by institutions recognizing that genuine mastery requires more than a number on a transcript. Some institutions are experimenting with hybrid models. Contract grading, where students collaborate with professors on defining learning expectations. Specifications grading, which assesses based on demonstrated mastery rather than cumulative points. Pass-fail courses with narrative feedback, allowing students to focus on learning over ranking. And portfolio-based assessments, where students showcase skills and long-term projects rather than rely on cumulative test scores. And even within a graded structure, we can change how we think about student achievement, placing greater emphasis on portfolio-based assessments, faculty mentorship, and individualized evaluations that reflect true mastery. Because ultimately, education is not supposed to be a competition for numbers. New college students understood something that many institutions still struggle with. Excellence isn't about perfection, it's about progress. In 50 years of using narrative evaluations, faculty and students at New College saw firsthand that meaningful assessment fosters meaningful learning. And if assessment doesn't reflect that, then what exactly are we measuring? Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Before I introduce our panel, I would like to remind you that you can send in your questions at the bottom of the screen at the Q&A tab. With me today, we have Bill Dudley, Senior Research Scholar at Princeton University and a member of the UBS Board of Directors. From 2009 to 2018, Mr. Dudley was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He earned a BA from New College and a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you for joining us, Bill. And welcome also Isaac Tellechea, a writer and journalist who is currently editor-in-chief of the Old School Catalyst, which is a startup nonprofit focused on student journalism, which we'll be talking about later. Isaac graduated from New College in the winter of 2024 with a BA in English and creative writing. Our first question is going to be that Dr. Miles speaks of grade-centric behavior that starts long before college. Students, especially bright ones, learn to game the system. I know both of you have experienced a traditional grading system, whether that was in high school or at other universities, and that the lack of grades was a big part of your decision to come to New College. How willing do you think students might be to give up a system of grades that has shaped their identity up until this point? Maybe we can start with Bill.
Obviously it depends on the student. Some students like the direction that the grades, defines the environment for them very well. But for me, at least, I have to say that one of the reasons I left Columbia University after my freshman year to new colleges, I found the grades were a bit of a tyranny. In other words, I was too focused on the grade as opposed to focused on learning. And I made a really conscious decision to go to new college because it was unstructured, because it was evaluations, because I thought, well, I'm just going to throw myself into the deep end of the pool here, and I'm either going to learn because I want to learn, and grades aren't going to be my motivation. I remember in prep school, my first year in prep school, I was a second honor student. That's what I was, a second honors every marking period. And then the second year, I made a mistake and made first honors the first marking period. And that was all of a sudden my new standard that I had to achieve. That's really not the right motivations for learning. And so I think, when I went to Columbia, I escaped that a little bit because it was a little bit less confining. But new college, I was running a little experiment on myself. Are you motivated to learn for learning's sake? And as it turned out, I was, and that was the experiment worked out well from my perspective.
I agree. I think it depends on the person. It really, I think there is a certain people that like the structure of grades. And to be honest, I don't think narrative evaluations would work for everybody if they're not feeling ready for it. I think there needs to be a certain level of buy-in. But similarly to you, Bill, I mean, for myself, it was really the ideal situation. I never felt more fulfilled out of an education experience than I did when I received narrative evaluations because it felt like I had something tangible to build off of, especially if it was a course like, with the catalyst being a course on campus, that was something that I took repeatedly. So being able to have those narrative evaluations and have something to build off of was incredibly important because even though you're in the same environment, you're taking what is basically the same class, over and over again. It's really it's kind of a testament to how much the narrative evaluation helps that I still felt like I was able to grow despite having, 3 semesters worth of experience taking this class. I still felt like I had room to grow even by the time that I was ready to graduate. So I really think that, the rigidity of the grade structure is something that helps for certain people and, all the power to them. But like for myself, it was way better to just feel like I had a more of a purpose than just a letter grade or a number at the end of the semester.
Yeah, some people definitely wanted the structure, and I remember when I was at New College in 1971 to 74, there were people that basically couldn't operate in an environment without grades because they couldn't feel motivated.
Yeah, like you said, it was I liked what you said. Grades can't beat my motivation, something along those lines. I had a teacher in high school who had he actually went to New College for humanities back in the day, and he gave us a couple of stories where he was somebody who really had to find his motivation at the school. It was going from that structure of grades, he got to a system where it was pass fail, and then he thought to himself, this is so much easier. I can just kind of do my own thing, like it's at my own pace. And he started to kind of fall victim to that, like if you don't motivate yourself and if you don't take charge of your own education, then you're kind of wasting your time.
Definitely. And something you both touched on is how in a graded environment, it can sometimes be limiting or end up being a mark of shame on the identity of the student. How do you think your approach to failure has been different now that you've been through this narrative evaluation system?
Well, I think it does allow you to take more risk, clearly, and in the sense that you're not worried about the negative consequence of the grade. But some evaluations aren't so reassuring either. I took a course that was student taught, literature course, And the evaluation basically said I couldn't think, read, or write at the end. It was mainly because I read the books in a different way than they did. I had a different sort of approach to how I was approaching literature than they did. I didn't take it too personally, but so even evaluations could be pretty harsh at times. I think the biggest thing about evaluations is just there's a lot more nuance. There's a lot more nuance. Like you're to do well in this area, you need room for improvement here, and you're getting feedback because your sense of how you're doing may not be the sense of your faculty member, right? The other problem with grades, of course, is they just don't really apply very well to independent study and things of that nature. I went off when I was at New College. I did an independent study project where I worked for the McGovern campaign in California primary. And then actually did a contract where I went off to California, went off to Ohio for the general election, and had a contract. I don't know how you grade that contract. Did I did I deserve an A or an A minus or B? There's some things that just don't translate to a grading kind of scalar.
Yeah, and on that note, I think that something that I learned about, or at least my approach to successes and failures in an academic setting, was that even in positive evaluations, there were almost like failures in my successes, in the sense that like there were a few times where I would get a positive evaluation that would still have a little bit of, notes that are recommendations or comments that say things that I could do better. Um, and that to me was invaluable. I really liked not just having the positive side of things, but also knowing what it was that I could build off of and what it was that, I did wrong. Because at the end of the day, it's all a learning process. In order to learn, you have to fail. So that kind of really opened my eyes to just thinking about, even when I'm doing well, there are things that I could do better.
It makes it more of a journey. You're not just taking each course or individually as a self-defined unit. It's a journey. You can sort of see how you're progressing as you go through time.
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. And if I think back to my experience at New College, the classes that I fully failed, that I didn't pass, are the ones that I sometimes remember most because those were the key moments where I pushed myself the hardest, whether it was I was taking way too much on my course load, which happened often, or it was way above my skill level. But those really show me where my limits were. And when I got that evaluation, it was specific to me. It wasn't just this ominous grade where I had to guess what the professor was thinking or anything like that. So, on that topic, how in the narrative evaluation sort of system does the relationship between you and your peers, the other students, and you and your professor change?
Well, you're not in a competition for starters. It's not like there's only so many, good evaluations to be handed out. If everyone does well, everyone would get a positive evaluation. But the other thing is the nuance. I mean, so some person might be good in one area, and someone else in another area. How do you collapse that all into a single numerical grade? It's sort of silly when you think about it. I mean, college is about skill development, right? It's not just about as Steve Miles was talking, jumping through hoops. It's about developing your skills, and I think the narrative approach provides much more guidance about how to develop your skills than letter grades do.
Definitely. And this kind of circles back to the previous question as well, the scarlet letter of the grades. I mean, I went to a school in Sarasota that was, an accelerated gifted school, but there it was everybody was so focused on grades that it really was a competition. And, you know, if not everybody does well on everything, so in those times when you did experience a failure, it felt like something that you didn't want to share with anybody. It felt like something that you just wanted to kind of bury and move on from. And for me, that's never been any sort of solution for anything or any positive way of growth. Whenever I've failed anything, I feel like I've always had to, confront that head on. And I never wanted to do that when I would get, a big red F on a paper or just log into my grading portal and see something I didn't want to see. It just became a source of anxiety and a source of shame rather than anything that I felt like I could take something away from.
I think I was mostly traumatized by my bad grades.
Exactly.
Yeah. And now that we're seeing, ChatGPT come into play, and in a graded system, the goal is just to get a certain grade. And sometimes the most efficient path for that is taking shortcuts like that. And that's completely against the point of why we go to education and why we have that. So we're seeing a lot of interesting things like that where grades becoming more arbitrary. But Isaac, can you talk a little bit more about your experience on the Catalyst and how it was being a student journalist in a class that had that narrative evaluation aspect?
Yes. So the narrative evaluations were fantastic in really because there's so many layers to the practice of journalism in general that I felt like there was a lot of opportunity for an evaluation, whether that was a student's interviewing skills, writing skills, storytelling, structure, you name it. It was so many different fields that I could improve on. So having the opportunity to read what it was that I excelled in, what it was that I felt that my professor felt that I could do better in, that was really special. And it gave me something that I, things that I still feel like I use to this day. In addition to that, I worked with the same professor, the sponsor of the Catalyst, Maria Vesperi, the entire time that I took the course. So I felt that we were able to develop a really strong relationship, and I was able to, after narrative evaluation and evaluation after evaluation, really understand what it was that, Maria was looking for it to teach her students, but also what it was that she could really help me with in my own skills. And that was something that I don't really think that I could get in a traditional grading system. And, even in addition to the narrative evaluations, I think just the space of the way that the course was structured, having my fellow writers, my fellow students in the meetings, we would pitch story ideas, we would read the beginnings of our stories, and they would be, giving us some similar like verbal evaluations, just some like um, working together collaboratively on what people thought of your stuff, what people thought of your writing. Maybe they could point you in the right direction of somebody to interview, a particular angle of the story that you weren't looking at. All of these were factors that produced an environment that I felt was so open to learning that I really appreciated it.
Yeah, definitely. And we had a question from Dr. Oker in the chat where she's talking about how the narrative evaluations can be a great tool for professors to identify talents that the students don't necessarily see in themselves. Did either of you have an experience where you saw something positive in your evaluation that you didn't see before?
I don't remember anything specific because I'm obviously too old to remember that far back. But I do think that the valuations do give you confidence because that you get a sense of progress, that you're making progress as you're going through your education. And I think that makes that makes you also more inclined to feel like you're not like confined within a certain, you know, rigid structure. I mean, my whole career, I've sort of been willing to take quite a bit of risk in terms of what I've taken on, and I think that it really did start with New College, frankly. And how much of it is due to the grading system. I mean, I think that's probably not the only thing, but it does sort of free you up, and you realize also, the consequences of not doing well isn't the end of the world. As long as you learn from that and sort of keep going.
Definitely. And I think it's an important aspect for people to know and understand about this system is that with the narrative evaluations, you're comparing how you started in that class and how you ended in that class. It's not comparing how you were compared to any other student. So if you came in and you already knew everything, the professor is going to expect a lot more from you and they're going to want to see that growth. And that's what you can see in the evaluation. They can talk about those things, which means that you're, in traditional classes, if you're already very good, if you already know Spanish and you're taking a Spanish class, you're going to ace it. But if you do that at New College, the bar is going to be much higher. You're going to be expected to aspire to excellence. But Isaac, another thing we wanted to touch on was your ventures with the old school catalyst. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, definitely. Um, it's been a project that myself, Maria Vesperi, Sophia Brown, and Gabby, a number of alums and some former faculty from New College have been working on for since the December of 2023. Since the political events at New College, the environment that I previously described at the Catalyst became a bit more untenable. It just was not the same kind of environment that was conducive to learning that it had been historically. Um, and Maria was on the verge of retirement, and it would never had occurred to any of us that with Maria's retirement that the Catalyst would go away, and nobody wanted that to happen. So we've been working on Old School Catalyst, which is a nonprofit independent of the school, where we essentially want to take the spirit, that learning environment that we had on campus in the Catalyst, and we want to make it something available to students nationwide. Right now, we have a team of writers who are alums and current students at New College who were all members of the Catalyst, or mostly previous members of the Catalyst. And we've just been trying to take that structure of learning by doing. We have weekly meetings, and we try to guide young reporters with some more experienced student reporters like myself and Sophia Brown and other alums, but then also the professional guidance of people like Maria and some other advisors that we've recruited. And you know, like I said, learning by doing. We really try to structure the meetings like they're a newsroom. We try to teach people the basics of effective journalism and ethical journalism at that, because in this day and age, it's really necessary.
Yeah. And it's a great example of taking the New College philosophy and taking it out into the real world and trying to apply it. And so, Bill, in your experience, you've probably seen a bit of a disconnect between people who've been successful in college and then maybe not so successful in the workplace. How do you think narrative evaluative systems might help sort of bridge that gap?
Well, if you think about when you go into your career, you don't get grades anymore. You get formal evaluations, and you just have sidebar conversations with the people that are your mentors or potentially your boss, direct line of report. And it's those conversations that sort of help you understand about the culture of the organization, the things that you need to work on, the opportunities that you might pursue. You wouldn't get any of that from a letter grade. I mean, a letter grade is basically a shorthand, right? It's a sorting device, very valuable perhaps for colleges to admit people from high school and things like that, but not very valuable from a career perspective. And that's why I think you don't see them at all. No one's ever asked me about my grades. After you're out of college for a couple of years, no one asked you what your grades were. They just want to know what skills do you have today that you can bring to the opportunities that you're facing. So grades I think are they're sort of like the lazy man's way out in some ways.
Certainly. And can you touch on a little bit on your thoughts on why largely we rely so much on the graded system in this society? And is there something or some reason why we might be afraid to let go of grades? And what might happen if we did?
I think there's two things. Number one, grading is a lot faster for the faculty. So, to do what New College faculty members have done, it takes a lot of time, thought, and consideration. A grade, you can just write that down in, a couple seconds. So I think that, it's like learning how to write. I mean, you learn how to write by writing, but you also learn how to write by someone taking your writing and evaluating it critically. I remember when I first went to work for JP Morgan, when I submitted my articles for publication, they came back with a lot of red ink. And it was that red ink that actually helped me learn how to write. If you'd sent it back with a letter grade, B or C. I wouldn't learn much at all about how to make those pieces better.
Definitely. So, do you think that this narrative evaluation type of system is limited to smaller institutions like New College, or it could be applied in other universities, maybe fully or in other ways?
I think in certain kinds of classroom settings, I mean, I think it'd be very hard for a professor in intro economics with a class of 400 people at UC Berkeley, where I went to graduate school, to write individual evaluations. Um, but when you're correcting people's tests or essays, I mean, much more informative than the letter grade are all the comments on the side. And when I was grade, I always try to not just give you a letter grade, but also tell you, give you a little bit of feedback of why you're getting that letter grade. When I was at Princeton, it was ironic. We're having this conversation about grades. I was actually viewed as a hard grader at Princeton, and I wasn't a hard grader because I was trying to be mean, but I felt that the people who were really, really capable and competent and worked really hard shouldn't be mushed together with the people that were, maybe coasting a little bit. So I wanted to make sure that there was a bit of a distribution in the grades to sort of point out to give the right incentive system that if you work hard, you're going to get a better grade, and if you're trying to coast, you're not. But I do think evaluations are far superior to grades.
Yeah, like you said, Bill, I think that it really depends on the class. And I think not only on the class size, but more so the class itself. Because, I mean, like you're saying, in an intro to economics, if it's like a lecture hall style class where it's just a professor talking to a group of students, there's not really much room for evaluation in the classroom setting, I would imagine, anyways. Um, and, I do think that size does have something to do with it because I think that one of the best parts about New College was the small class sizes because I was actually able to have a relationship with my professors. And that's something in talking to people that went to other schools. It's something that's not really as common as you would see. Especially, I mean, in Florida state schools, it's really not that common. So I do think there is something to the size, even, just thinking about the practicality of it. But yeah, I think it depends on what you're doing in the class, how many people there are, what the professor is looking to do. I think it
And,
would work better at a smaller institution.
and the professors have to buy into it. They have to view that
Definitely.
this is what we want to do. This is how I want to spend my time. I mean, at big universities, most of the attention is on research and publishing in journals, and that means that the teaching side gets sort of squeezed down, and the evaluation sides get squeezed down even more. So I think it's better for a smaller liberal arts institution. I think Amherst and a Williams College, they could implement this kind of approach, but a big state university, I think, would be very difficult.
Certainly. As you both said, you need buy-in from the students and buy-in from the faculty, and then buy-in from the administration, because they have to create an environment the professors are able to do this, that they're not overwhelmed and overworked, that they have the time to really focus on their students. We have a question in the chat for Bill. It says that you went from New College to Berkeley. Were there grades in your PhD program, and how did that affect you?
Yeah, the grades didn't really matter that much. I mean, I think the way I would take grades at graduate school level is it's like a red light, green light, orange light, right? If you get an A, you're on the right track. If you get a B plus, the amber, something is not clicking. If you get a B, it's like you're in big trouble. Maybe you shouldn't be here. The irony of my graduate school career is I spend most of my time doing macroeconomics now, and the one B I got in graduate school was from George Akerlof in macroeconomics. And I know George quite well. He's the husband of Janet Yellen, who I obviously worked for very closely at the Federal Reserve. And I was delighted in telling George that I worked out okay in macro despite my B that he gave me. So I guess that numerical grade, the only B I got in graduate school, wasn't so predictive of my future performance.
That makes sense. And this is just another reminder that if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I wanted to sort of go back to one of the quotes from the video. It says that excellence isn't about perfection, it's about progress. And I sort of wanted to know from both of your experience, how has this system helped you progress towards excellence? Especially as we talked about previously in some of these traditional graded environments, it's almost like a bar. And if you meet it, you're good, but your bar may be way higher than that is, or you may be going for a completely different reason. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I think you go first this time.
Oh, sure. Um, yeah, I that's a good question. I think that it's interesting because for me, I felt that, sorry, let me collect my thoughts here for a second. But I think for me it was interesting because I think I tried a lot of things that I didn't think I would ever try at New College because of this system. And a lot of excellence to me was being well-rounded. I wanted to not just be really good at one thing. I wanted to have my hand in a lot of different areas, and that was one of the things that attracted me to New College. And so I think that thinking about my academic experience not just as a means to an end, thinking about that finish line of getting a degree and getting a job, I really wanted to consider how it would affect me as a person. So, taking certain classes of things that I had never really been interested in before or had never even really thought about before. And then it turns out that, I was actually able to dedicate months of my life to a subject and get pretty interested in it. And to me, that was something that was so remarkable and something that I really loved, especially because so many of the courses at New College were things that you would never be able to find anywhere else. My one of my first semesters there, I took a course in it was the only music course I'd ever taken in my life, pretty much. But it was an introduction to electronic music using the system that I had never used before. And I don't know if I would ever do it again, but I do think it made me a better person because of it, because I worked in a field that I'm not familiar with. I got to learn a discipline that I was never really that, immersed in. And I don't know, I loved it.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think the two things I would say is number one, it helps you to be willing to take more risk. And because you take more risk, you can build your human capital a lot faster. And I always tell people, in their careers, it's really about building your human capital, finding something that really interests you. If you find something that really interests you, you'll probably do it well. As you do it well, you'll build your human capital. And when you find you're not building your human capital anymore, it's time to go off and do something else. And I think the whole New College system sort of allows you to make those pivots that I don't think you would make in a more confining a framework.
Certainly. And I think the thing about New College, since we sort of started off the bat with this type of system, since 1960, we've been developing a whole culture off of this. So it's not necessarily just constrained to the classroom, it's how everyone talks to each other in the cafeteria. It's how we approach everything beyond classrooms to how we approach student government, how we approach just our life decisions about taking risks and how you evaluate yourself. And one of the questions that we had in the chat is, how do you think the narrative evaluations affected your relationship with your professor and student? And I could actually start this off because was very close with my professor, Professor Rohrbacher. He was my mentor for all 4 years. And it was interesting because one of the first things he said to me in the first year or so is that he'd never had a classic students like me before. And at first, I was a little concerned, but I think he meant it in a good way, in that I came to this field from a different standpoint. I was interested in different ways than the traditional student, and I was going down a different path. And so, with that, I got to learn a lot from him, and I think he learned a lot from me as well. And so, can you guys talk a little bit about your relationships with the professor and student in this type of system?
Well, I think the big thing is, you feel like the professor sort of has your back to take on bigger projects, bigger things. So I looked at my career at New College, and I did independent study project where I was studying the transportation system in Jacksonville, Florida. Why Jacksonville, Florida? Because the county and the city are all one thing. And so it was a very interesting place to analyze. And the most amazing thing I learned about that, I went in with a very naive view that, of course, you're going to build the bridges where it makes sense to build the bridges across the rivers. Well, it turned out that wasn't actually the case at all. You were going to build the bridges where people actually owned real estate. or didn't want the bridge in their backyard. So I learned a lot about like the political process of what gets done in sort of urban planning that's not really taught very clearly in the textbooks. So I think that it basically allows you to do things that are a lot broader than you otherwise could do. Working on the political campaign, I mean, I learned so much about politics, but also about how do you motivate people. When you're in a political campaign, you have an army of volunteers. How do you get those volunteers to do what you'd like them to do? You learn a lot about psychology. When I arrived in Berkeley, literally for the fall campaign, this is the McGovern campaign in 1972, there was rioting going on because of the Vietnam War, and the person in the McGovern office was very worried that the rioters were going to trash the McGovern office. And I said to him, well, if we act like they're going to, they will, and if we act like they won't, they probably won't. So let's just try this out. Let's act like they won't trash the office, and sure enough, they did. they passed the office and went on to the next thing. And so you learn a lot more than just about book learning. You learn about people and like psychology and how the world really works.
Yeah, definitely. I think that really the biggest thing that I have taken away from my relationships with my professors due to narrative evaluations is seeing, it's the human aspect of it. I felt like because my professors were able to see me as a person and, were essentially forced to because of the narrative evaluation system, I was also able to connect with my professors on a more human level. Even though I had mentor-mentee relationships with these professors, I also felt like we were peers in a sense. I don't know. It was a very special dynamic that it fostered.
I think I've said repeatedly, it's like New College is like graduate school for undergraduates. Because when I went to Berkeley graduate school, I felt like it was almost the same kind of setup.
Good to know as I'm heading into grad school. So one of the things that you touched on was the idea of incentives. And sometimes grades can be a really motivating factor for students. But we've seen at New College that this type of system can really help certain kind of students. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe what you think of the types of students or the types of people that thrive at New College, if there is a particular type or if anybody can?
Well, I mean, I can't generalize beyond myself, but I would say it's basically people that are okay with not so much structure and sort of want to do it for themselves. In other words, I'm not very good at taking orders. I've never been good at like people telling me what to do. So I sort of revolt against that kind of pressure. And so New College was sort of like, I'm driving, I get to drive my education a bit. And that made me a lot more comfortable.
I think it depends on the person, obviously. But I really do think that anybody can make it at New College as long as they have some buy-in. That's all it really takes. If you have, if you're interested in pretty much anything, and you have the drive and the motivation to say like, oh, I will push myself to do these things but not just because, not pushing myself because it feels like I need to force myself, but it's also something that I genuinely want. If you're somebody who is open to learning, interested in learning, I really do think that you could thrive at New College as long as you just buy in.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to work if you're just going to college because your parents told you had to go to college.
Yeah.
Exactly. That makes sense. And we have another question in the chat. It says, do you think that there are any negatives to the evaluation system? Additionally, do you feel as though you were able to get the same mastery of subjects at New College than you may have at another school? And I can actually start us off because in talking to other classic students from other schools, I've always felt that they have a much better mastery of all of the dates, the people, the timeline, all of the things you would have been forced to memorize, but they can't really talk about it in a more abstract way or debate different ideas because they're sort of in the system where this is what they were told. And they question a lot of things a lot less. So can you talk maybe it was the first part was negatives about the evaluation system or feel as though you were able to get the same mastery at New College compared to other schools?
Well, I mean, the quality of the evaluations varies by faculty member. I remember my first introductory economics class, the evaluation was pretty terse, and it came down to I did reasonably strong, which I translate that to like a B plus. So it really depends on the faculty member too, buying into the evaluation system. And as I said earlier, the one where I couldn't read, think, or write in my student taught literature class, wasn't really very helpful in terms of me understanding like what was the fundamental difference in the way I was viewing these books at the students that were teaching the course were reading these books, because obviously there was a philosophical difference that was causing this disconnect between how I experienced the class and how they experienced me experiencing the class.
I don't think that I ever felt like I was being cheated from not having grades, but that also could just be my own bias because I loved the idea of not having grades, and that's why I wanted to go to New College. But I will say that in talking to some um, people who are my age and a few years removed either direction, who have gone to J schools, journalism schools, I will say the education, I'm so grateful for the education that New College gave me in that sense because I loved that I learned by doing. I loved that I was basically thrown into it with some guidance, like thrown into the deep end with some floaties and essentially just like learn by failing. That's what I loved. And in talking to a lot of people that went to journalism schools, it was a lot of theory, it was sitting at a desk and, reading books, learning, which I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I just loved that there was so much that I felt like I learned just by messing up on the spot or in the moment that, just reading about that stuff, it wouldn't have given me the same experience. And, with a field like journalism that's so it's almost anthropological in a lot of ways, I really am just glad that I wasn't just reading from a book and I was actually able to talk to people and interview people and understand what that was like and go through the fire that way. That was invaluable.
And we have another question. It's asking about the bigger societal impact of the fact that our education system is grade-based, it's compliance-based. What are the wider effects of that? And are we supplying society with the tools students need as college graduates?
Well, I think that the biggest problem is that certain people don't start off with the same initial endowment in terms of their family and the expectations of their family and the resources the family can provide them. And so you have a situation where, people who went to a not so good school system with not so good teachers are going to be at a disadvantage with someone like me who went to a prep school. And, that can then feed back into those people's self-confidence. And that can feed back into their aspirations, and that can cause them to limit their aspirations. So I think, the grading system can sort of perpetuate inequality in some way, right? Because people who have more resources and advantages are going to get more opportunity, and so that their success is going to tend to be self-reinforcing. So I think that the inequality aspects of it, I think, need to be looked at really carefully, because coming into college, I mean, people are at very different levels from different high schools in the country. And I really experienced that at Columbia. I was well ahead of most of my peers as a freshman at Columbia. And so that made it easier for me to get good, same grades as they did with working a lot less with a lot less intensity. I did 2 college sports when I was a freshman at Columbia. So that obviously told you I had plenty of time beyond what I needed for my studies.
I think that you touched upon this earlier, Grace, when you mentioned the rise of like Chat GPT and these AI tools. I mean, it was already kind of prevalent when I was in middle and high school with readings, Spark Notes and the like. It became when the final result is a grade or a letter, whatever it may be, it's all about what's the most effective way to get to it, like you said, Grace. So that just fosters this kind of mindset of like, okay, if this is the easiest way to do it, why wouldn't I just do it? But the flip side of that is that in society, I feel like that's going to have a very negative impact, not just in the workforce, but just socially. I think that having these kinds of systems and the rise of so many tools that are going to help people game the system in so many ways is like just a bad thing for the social environment, to not have as many people who are, they're quote unquote educated because they went through a system of schooling, but are if they're not absorbing the information and these schools aren't actually producing educated people, then it's a waste of time.
Yeah, there's a real risk here that we have a sort of race. We're starting a race to the bottom. To
Yeah.
Isaac's point, you spend the least amount of energy to get the highest grade. That because your metric is input relative to grade output. That would be unfortunate because we actually what we'd like to see is more input.
Certainly, it reinforces that. And I think one of the best things about New College is that you can't hide in a narrative evaluation system because you're not being compared to anybody else. There's often you can't find the answers online. And I remember hearing stories about students getting their essays handed back from the professor because it said something like, the professor said, I know what I think. I want to know what you think. And they would have to redo the whole essay because it's not something you can find online. You really have to be able to think for yourself. And so, with that, we're going to close out the webinar. Thank you so much, Bill and Isaac, for being here. And thank you to Alt Liberal Arts. They're going to invite you to join us for a series of 3 lectures on the topic of academic freedom on June 4th, 11th, and 18th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Dr. Nicholas Tampio. Dr. Tampio is a New College of Florida and Johns Hopkins graduate and a professor of political science at Fordham University. He is the author of many volumes, including Common Core, Educational National Education Standards, and the Threat to Democracy. He often writes for public-facing outlets such as the Boston Globe, USA Today, and the Washington Post. You can register for this at altliberalarts.org. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a good day.